At midnight, the female CEO publicly humiliated the old janitor in front of her entire executive team. She mocked his worn uniform, accused him of spying, and ordered security to drag him out of the building. The employees laughed until the next morning. A black luxury convoy stopped outside headquarters. The same janitor stepped out, wearing a tailored suit, flanked by lawyers and board members. Inside the emergency meeting, the stunned CEO learned the impossible truth. The company had just been sold overnight, and the janitor she insulted was now the new owner. But his revenge had only begun. The city never slept. That was one truth Meridian Capital Group understood better than most, because the company itself was a kind of city, vertical, relentless, humming with ambition on every floor of its 40-story glass tower in the heart of downtown Chicago. At 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, when most of the city had already surrendered to darkness and quiet, the executive floors of Meridian blazed with light, with noise, with the particular intoxicating energy of people who believe they have just made history. The contract signing had been a triumph. $400 million secured, a partnership with a European investment consortium that would expand Meridian's reach across 3 new markets, a deal that had taken 11 months of negotiation, and that Victoria Langston had personally driven across the finish line by sheer force of will. She stood at the head of the long conference table in the 42nd floor boardroom, champagne flute in hand, her charcoal blazer still perfectly pressed after a 16-hour day, her dark hair still immaculate in the way that things are immaculate when they are maintained by discipline rather than luck. At 38 years old, Victoria was the youngest chief executive in the firm's 60-year history, and she wore that distinction like a second skin, smooth, fitted, impossible to penetrate from the outside. Around her, 14 senior executives laughed at her jokes, leaned into her observations, chased the warmth of her approval, the way people chase the warmth of a fire they know is capable of burning them. She was brilliant, and she knew it. She was powerful, and she never let anyone forget it. The view from the 42nd floor showed Chicago in all its glittering excess, the river threading through the canyon of skyscrapers, the distant taillights of traffic dissolving into the dark outer neighborhoods, the whole lit machine of a great American city running its nighttime operations without pause or sentiment. Victoria Langston believed, without hesitation, without a shred of honest doubt, that she deserved every last light she could see from where she was standing. The cleaning crew moved through the building like shadows, timed by long practice to appear only when the executives had gone, to do their work in the empty hours between the end of one business day and the beginning of the next, and to be invisible in the way that infrastructure is invisible, noticed only when it fails. But tonight the party had run long, the champagne had flowed past the usual hour, and a single member of the overnight crew had slipped into the boardroom through the side service entrance, assuming, reasonably, that the room had been vacated. He was a man in his late 60s, perhaps older, broad-shouldered but lean, carrying his age the way mountains carry theirs, with an unhurried solidity that had nothing to prove. He had silver hair cut close to his head, a face that bore the kind of deep quiet that only accumulates over a long life carefully examined, and the measured movements of someone for whom this work had long since left the category of effort and entered the category of simple rhythm. He wore the standard gray uniform of the building's maintenance staff, a laminated ID badge clipped to his breast pocket, and he pushed his cart with the ease of a man who had pushed it through this exact corridor 10,000 times before. His badge read simply, Walter. He had paused near the far end of the conference table, not to snoop, not to linger in a space where he had no business, but because a document had slipped from a folder and landed near his feet. He bent to collect it the way anyone bends to collect something that lands in front of them. He glanced at it the way eyes glance at things placed directly in their path. That was the moment Victoria turned and saw him. She went still. Her eyes moved from the papers in Walter's hands to his gray uniform to his face, and something cold and automatic switched on behind her expression. A circuit she had wired into herself so long ago, it no longer required thought to activate. The laughter in the room died first, then the conversation, then the ambient noise of clinking glasses, until the only sound in the boardroom was the distant low murmur of the city far below. What exactly? Victoria said, her voice precise and quiet, in the way a blade is quiet before it finds its mark. "Do you think you are doing?" Walter set the document back on the table without haste. He looked at her with an evenness that was not defiance, but was not submission either. "I was collecting what had fallen," he said. "The room ran later than I expected. I can come back." Victoria did not step aside. She walked toward him slowly, with the full, deliberate weight of her authority preceding her like a physical force. The way authority moves when it has been exercised so consistently, it no longer requires a performance, or perhaps, when its performance has become so rehearsed, it has ceased to feel like one. "You are reading confidential materials," she said. It was not a question. It was a verdict delivered in the place where a question should have been. Around the room, executives shifted. One or two smiled carefully, reading the temperature, doing what people in hierarchies do when the person at the top makes clear which direction the pressure is moving. "I picked up a piece of paper from the floor," Walter said. His voice remained entirely steady, neither defensive nor cold. It was the voice of someone who has had a long time to practice not being rattled by people like this. "I'm not sure that qualifies as reading." Victoria's eyes made a slow, deliberate circuit of him. His uniform, his cart, his worn shoes, his hands, his age. The assessment was unhurried and completely public, performed for the room as much as for him. "How long," she said, "have you been working in this building?" 23 years, Walter said. She laughed. It was a short, bright sound, the kind of laugh that is used as a tool rather than an expression, and it released the tension in the room in precisely the wrong direction. The executives laughed, too, cautiously at first. Then, with more conviction as they read that Victoria intended to continue. 23 years of pushing a mop, she said. "And you still have not learned to stay within the boundaries of your role." She set her champagne flute on the table, without looking away from him. "People like you spend your entire working lives maintaining spaces built by people like us, and still, you find a way to be curious about things that will never belong to you. You cannot help it, can you? Always looking at a world that is not yours to look at." Someone near the window cleared their throat. The laughter thinned, but did not stop. Victoria was in full motion now, executing the particular performance she had mastered over a decade of inhabiting spaces where performance was currency sharp, fluent, utterly assured. "You are old enough to know better," she said. Her voice dropped slightly, which was more dangerous than when it was loud. "And if you do not, allow me to be clear. There is an order to things in this world. That order exists for reasons that people in your position are not required to understand. People like you do not get to dream above your station. The boundary exists because it must." She turned to the security officer stationed near the door. "Please escort him out," she said. Tonight, Walter had not moved. He had not flinched or reddened or looked toward the floor in the way people look at the floor when they are trying to find a place to put shame that has been placed on them without their consent. He held her gaze the entire time, with an expression that contained no anger, no visible hurt, no wounded pride. What it contained was something older and more patient than any of those things. Something that looked, from the right angle, like a man who already knew the rest of this particular story, and found it neither surprising nor especially interesting. He reached for the handle of his cart. Then he paused, just briefly, with his hand on the bar. "Are you certain," he said, "that you want to do this?" Victoria smiled the thin, precise smile of someone who has already moved on from the conversation. "Get out," she said. Walter nodded once. He pushed his cart through the door and disappeared into the corridor beyond it, without another word, without looking back. The boardroom returned to itself almost immediately. The laughter resumed. The champagne was poured. The executives congratulated one another on the evening's success and on the formidable woman who had delivered it. No one spoke about the old man, in the gray uniform. No one examined the particular quality of the silence he had left behind, the silence of a man who had not been beaten, who had simply chosen to stop engaging. Which is a very different thing, though it can look the same to people not paying close enough attention. No one noticed that, before he had turned to leave, just for a moment, something that might have been described as the ghost of a smile had passed across his face, not a smile of amusement, a smile of resolution. Morning came with its usual indifference to what the night before had held. Victoria arrived at 7:45, sharp and certain as always, and settled into the rhythms of her day before the rest of the executive floor had finished arriving. She made a brief note to have HR process the janitor's termination paperwork. The building's contractor would need to be notified, and then she set the thought aside entirely, the way you set aside minor administrative details, and opened her laptop. The overnight market data was not what she had hoped. Meridian's shares had dropped 4 points in pre-market trading. Unusual, but not alarming. She pulled the analyst notes and found something that sharpened her attention without yet shaping it into anything she could name. There had been sustained and unusual volume in Meridian's shares over the preceding 3 weeks, not volatile, not chaotic, but structured, methodical, the pattern of an entity accumulating rather than trading. She forwarded the analysis to her CFO with a one-line note, asking him to explain it before the 9 o'clock meeting. At 9, the senior leadership team gathered. Martin Walsh, the chief financial officer, presented the capital flow summary with the particular careful flatness he adopted when he was about to deliver information he did not fully understand. 17% of outstanding shares had changed hands through various holding structures over the previous month. The beneficial ownership chain was his word layered. Offshore vehicles, multiple jurisdictions, executed with professional precision by someone who understood exactly how to move through regulatory structures without creating visible disturbance. Victoria asked if they were looking at a hostile bid. Martin said it was possible. He said it was also possible the consolidation was already complete. He said this last part very quietly. A board member named Gerald Fitch received a message on his phone during the meeting that he read once and did not share. His expression did not change, but he stopped contributing to the discussion. Sandra Okafor, the head of human resources, raised the incident from the previous evening: 2 informal staff complaints, the janitor's clean record, 23 years of service, the visible distress of several employees who had witnessed the exchange. Victoria said, "Handle it," with the tone that meant the subject was finished. Sandra did not raise it again. 4 miles away, Walter Harrison sat in the private reception room of a bank that had no sign on its door. The managing director slid a folder across the table. Walter read 2 pages and signed where indicated. He signed 3 documents total. The managing director rose and bowed his head in the way that people bow to significant authority. In the parking garage, a black car waited, and the man who opened its door addressed the passenger not as Walter but as Mr. Harrison, and the name fit like something that had never really been put away. The emergency board meeting convened at 2 in the afternoon without a distributed agenda, which was itself a sufficient communication to everyone in the room. Victoria entered to find 8 of the 9 board members already present, and the particular atmospheric condition that precedes difficult institutional announcements, everyone very carefully arranging their faces into expressions of neutral attentiveness, while avoiding direct eye contact with the person most directly implicated. George Whitfield, the chairman, 82 years old, and still in possession of a precision of mind that had outlasted 3 prior CEOs, sat at the far end of the table with his hands flat and his gaze somewhere in the middle distance. "The controlling interest in Meridian Capital Group," Whitfield said, before Victoria had finished settling into her chair, "changed hands as of this morning. A purchase agreement was executed through Harrison Meridian Holdings, finalizing a 54% stake. The transaction was structured across the preceding 6 months and completed in stages consistent with all applicable securities regulations. The board has been formally notified." Victoria heard each word with perfect clarity. The difficulty was in the assembly, in the way the words kept failing to produce the meaning they should have produced, as though some essential translation mechanism had simply stopped working. "That is not possible," she said. "A transaction of that scale cannot go undetected." "It went undetected," Whitfield said, "because it was executed by someone who understood the structure of this organization at a level of depth that is difficult to appreciate without having spent considerable time within it." He glanced toward the door. "He has asked to say a few words before we proceed." The boardroom doors opened. Walter Harrison walked in wearing a black suit, that had been made specifically for him, not purchased, not chosen from a rack, but constructed by someone who understood that certain people wear clothing and certain people inhabit it, and Harrison inhabited this suit with the unhurried authority of a man who has nothing left to prove and has known it for some time. He was flanked by 2 senior attorneys and followed by a pair of board members who had apparently known the full truth for considerably longer than anyone else in the room. The executives who had been present the night before, who had lifted their glasses while an old man in a gray uniform was asked to understand his place in the order of things, stood up from their chairs, not because anyone had asked them to. They stood the way people stand when understanding arrives too late to be comfortable, but early enough to still be humiliating. George Whitfield rose and inclined his head in a gesture that was not casual. "Welcome back, Mr. Harrison," he said. "The company has been waiting." Victoria Langston's hand shifted against her coffee cup. The cup scraped the table. The sound was small. In the silence of that room, it was enormous. Harrison walked to the head of the table and stood for a moment looking at the chair. Then he looked at Victoria. He did not smile. He did not project satisfaction or triumph or any of the emotions the room might have expected from a man in his position. He simply pulled the chair back and sat down in it with the unhurried ease of someone returning to a seat that had always, on some essential level, been his. He had built this company before she had known it existed. That was the part Victoria kept returning to in the hours that followed. The fact that refused to be comfortable, regardless of how many times she turned it over. Walter Harrison had not always been Walter the maintenance man. He had been in a documented, public, celebrated life that preceded his disappearance from the record, the founding architect of Meridian Capital Group itself. He had constructed it from a 2-room office and a single institutional client, had grown it through 2 market downturns and 1 near-catastrophic liquidity crisis, had shaped it into the 40-story structure of finance and reputation that Victoria had inherited and called her own. His photograph had been on magazine covers. His name had been invoked as a standard of excellence in the industry for nearly 2 decades. And then, his wife had died. Margaret Harrison, after 22 years of marriage and 8 months of a cancer that moved faster than anyone was prepared for, had simply stopped being in the world. The absence she left was not something Harrison could solve by working longer hours or restructuring a portfolio. It was not a problem that responded to his particular kind of intelligence. He had sold his visible holdings quietly, transferred operational control to a board he had chosen with care, and removed himself from the public record with the completeness that only significant resources can purchase. What he had done next, almost no one knew. He had gone back to his own building. He had applied for a position on the maintenance staff under a different name, accepted the gray uniform and the laminated badge and the cart with its specific smell of industrial cleaner, and he had gone to work on the upper floors of the company he had founded. Not out of grief-induced confusion, not out of any desire for self-punishment. He had done it because of a question Margaret had asked him, in one of her last lucid months, had asked him with the directness that people acquire when they understand their time is limited and they no longer have patience for the circuitous approach. She had said, "You've built this entire thing, and I believe you when you say you built it for people. But do you actually know any of them? Do you know what it feels like to work there if you are not the one giving the orders?" He had not been able to answer her. He had decided that he needed to be able to answer her before he handed the company to the next generation of leadership. And so he had done the only thing that would allow him to answer honestly. He observed. For 23 years, he observed. He watched 14 leadership iterations come and go. He watched the culture shift and harden, and sometimes briefly soften and harden again. He watched how the executives spoke to the security guards in the morning, when they thought no one of consequence was watching. He learned who remembered the names of the people who cleaned their offices and who didn't bother. He listened in corridors and break rooms and elevator banks to the unguarded conversations that happen when people believe they are surrounded only by furniture. He saw real kindness. The vice president, who once spent 45 minutes helping a young maintenance worker file a safety incident report because the form was confusing and she simply didn't want to leave until the man understood it. He saw the senior analyst who had quietly paid for a junior colleague's medical expense out of his own pocket without mentioning it to anyone. Those people received, over the years, quiet and untraceable assistance, a recommendation that appeared without explanation, an opportunity that opened as if by coincidence. Walter had his mechanisms. He had also seen the other kind, the kind who did not see the maintenance staff at all, in the full and complete sense of not seeing that is different from simple oversight, the kind who had decided, at some point in their accumulation of status, that certain categories of people were part of the scenery rather than part of the story. Of all the leaders who had occupied the corner office during his time in the building, none had been as thorough in this particular blindness as Victoria Langston. He had watched her for 3 years. He had cleaned the corridor outside her office and catalogued how she spoke to the woman who brought her coffee not cruelly, in the early years, but with the flat impersonality of someone interacting with a function rather than a person. He had mopped the executive bathroom floor and registered how she addressed the guards efficiently, correctly, with no unnecessary aggression, but also with no awareness that they existed as entities beyond their function. The night of the contract celebration had not surprised him. He had been waiting for something like it, in the way you wait for weather you have watched building on the horizon for a long time. He had gone into the boardroom, knowing the party might still be running, because he had wanted to see what she would do if given the opportunity. What she did was remove all remaining ambiguity. The documents the attorneys placed on the boardroom table represented 3 years of careful, thorough investigation work that Harrison had commissioned not out of vindictiveness, but out of the same methodical instinct for understanding that had built the company in the first place. He wanted to know who Victoria Langston actually was when no one with authority was watching. The report manipulation had begun, the evidence suggested, as something she might have convinced herself was protective adjusting projections in language designed to manage investor anxiety during a genuinely difficult quarter, presenting losses in frames that preserved confidence rather than eroding it. It was not invented from nothing. It had precedent in the firm's history and in the broader industry practice. But it had grown, as such things grow, when they are not named and examined, into something less defensible. The data sales were a harder fact. A subsidiary agreement, structured to avoid primary disclosure requirements. Executed during the darkest quarter of her tenure, in the kind of decision that is made in the specific psychological space where fear of failure and the habits of power intersect in the worst possible way. She had told herself it was a one-time measure. She had told herself the same thing 3 years later. The board members read the summary in silence. Harrison did not narrate it. He had learned, over decades of consequential meetings, that the most effective presentations are the ones that allow the material to make its own argument. Victoria kept her eyes on the table and breathed carefully, and thought, briefly and honestly, about the distance between the 16-year-old girl who had promised herself she would never apologize for a gap and the 38-year-old woman sitting in this room. The gap between those two people was not the kind that money fills. She had simply never stopped running long enough to notice it had opened. When the police arrived at the boardroom door, she was not surprised. She had known, somewhere beneath all the discipline and the training and the practiced composure, that something like this moment had been waiting for some time. The public version of the story moved through the media with the speed that significant corporate scandals always achieve financial press first, then the broader business coverage, then the front pages, then the full cascade of commentary that arrives once a story has achieved sufficient cultural velocity. Meridian Capital Group's suspended CEO. The data manipulation. The years of accumulated decisions made by a woman who had, in the end, allowed the accumulation of power to outpace the development of the judgment required to hold it responsibly. The stock fell sharply in the initial days, as stocks always fall when certainty is disrupted by revelation. But Harrison's stabilization team had been in place for weeks, and the market, after reading the incoming management's credentials and the restructuring plan that was released on the third day, began a gradual recovery that the analysts would later call, with the retrospective confidence of people who were not responsible for it, entirely predictable. Victoria was escorted from the building not in handcuffs. The legal process would require months, but with the quiet administrative finality of a revoked keycard. She stood in the lobby for a moment, in the marble space she had walked through 11 years ago, as a newly appointed executive dazzled by the scale of what she was being given, and she looked up at the building. The security guard who had removed Walter from the premises the previous night held the front door open for her. Because that was his job, and he held it with the same unhurried professionalism he brought to every task, in every hour of every shift, that no one in the executive suite had ever thought to acknowledge. Victoria saw him. Perhaps for the first time, she genuinely saw him. She walked out into the cold afternoon air and did not look back. 42 floors above her, Harrison stood at the window and watched the city rather than the street. He said, to the attorney standing behind him, "Humiliation creates monsters." That process ends here. What Harrison built in the months that followed was not a vindication narrative. It was a company. Rebuilt from the infrastructure up. The maintenance staff received a substantial wage adjustment within the first 3 weeks retroactive, meaning it included back payment, a detail that Harrison had insisted on, because he believed that remedying an injustice partially is a different thing from remedying it, and the distinction matters. The building's cleaning crew was brought into the same health coverage structure as the junior analysts, which caused a brief and technical administrative problem that was solved without fanfare. A new anonymous reporting mechanism was established for workplace conduct concerns designed by Sandra Okafor, who turned out to have had detailed and long-considered ideas about what such a system should look like, and ideas she had never been permitted to implement. The first all-staff meeting took place in the atrium on a Friday morning in early November. All 1,200 employees invited without exception, from the 42nd floor to the basement. Harrison stood at a simple lectern, no video screen, no slide deck, no production, and said that he had worked in this building for 23 years and had made it his business to know the name of every person he encountered in that time, because names are the most basic form of recognition one human being can offer another. He said that power reveals nothing about character that was not already present before the power arrived. It only turns up the volume on what is already there. He said the company's new standard, the one that would be embedded in every performance review and every promotion decision going forward, was this: you will be evaluated on how you treat the people who can do nothing for you. Near the back of the atrium, 3 women from the overnight cleaning crew stood together listening. One of them, a woman who had worked in the building for 11 years, began to cry quietly in the way that people cry when something they had quietly given up on unexpectedly returns. She had never been to an all-staff meeting. She had never been explicitly excluded from one. She had simply never been invited, and the omission had been so consistent and so complete that she had stopped noticing it as an omission and had reclassified it, over time, as the natural order of things. The crying was not dramatic. It was the small, private dissolution of a story she had told herself about what she was worth in that building. A story that turned out to have been wrong. 3 months after the board meeting, on a morning that had gone gray with early winter and the particular hush that settles over a city when the first cold front of the season arrives before people are ready for it, Victoria Langston made an appointment. She had been living in a rental apartment in a neighborhood she had never visited during her executive years. She had fewer possessions than she remembered accumulating. She walked in the mornings along routes that didn't go anywhere specific, past coffee shops and dry cleaners and small restaurants that opened early for people who needed to be somewhere by 7, and she looked at those people, the ones behind the counters, the ones mopping the sidewalk before opening, the ones restocking the shelves in the fluorescent light, with a quality of attention she had not previously brought to them. She arrived at the meeting wearing a plain coat over a plain shirt. No blazer, no armor. Harrison was already in the small conference room when she entered, drinking coffee from a paper cup, and he did not stand when she came in, not because he was being discourteous, but because the gesture wasn't required, and he did not perform gestures that weren't required. She sat across from him and held the silence for a moment before she began. "I'm not here about the legal proceedings," she said. "I know," he said. "I came to say that I'm sorry, not because it repairs anything or because you need to hear it. Because it's the truth, and I've been carrying it for long enough that it's become uncomfortable." She looked at her hands on the table, which were the hands of someone who had stopped maintaining the performance of perfect composure and was allowing the surface to be what it was. I've been thinking about why I treated people the way I did. Not the financial decisions, I understand those. I was frightened, and I made choices that frightened people make. But the other part, the way I looked at the maintenance staff, the security team, anyone who reminded me of a category I'd spent my whole life trying to exit. She paused. I grew up poor. Legitimately. Significantly poor, the kind that never entirely leaves you. That sits in the body and waits. And I spent so many years running from it that somewhere along the way I forgot that the people who reminded me of it were just people. I started treating the memory with contempt and taking it out on the humans who happened to represent it. Harrison was quiet for the length of several breaths. Being poor is not a shameful condition, he said. Losing your humanity in the act of leaving it behind, that is the thing that is worth grieving. She nodded once. She was close to crying, but she did not cry, not yet. I'm not going to restore your position, he said. I know, she said. That's not what I came for. He refilled his coffee, and without ceremony, filled a second cup and set it on her side of the table. She accepted it. They sat together in the small room for a while longer. Two people who had both built their understanding of the world from the wrong end of the telescope, and they drank their coffee in a silence that was not without difficulty, but was without pretense. And that was, at this point in both their lives, the more valuable of the two available options. The company found its footing over the following year. The way companies find their footing when the change is structural, rather than cosmetic slowly at first, then with an accelerating confidence that is visible not in the press releases but in the smaller daily textures of the place. Senior executives discovered that their performance reviews now included assessments submitted by direct reports and by the administrative staff who supported them, and by the building's service personnel who worked near them. Some executives were surprised by what they learned about themselves through this mechanism. A few left voluntarily. The ones who stayed adapted, which turned out to be possible for most people when the incentive structure is clear and consistent. Harrison kept an office on the 35th floor smaller than the one allocated to his CEO. Deliberately so, in a corner of the building that did not announce itself. He had a long-established preference for rooms that didn't declare what they were. On a Tuesday, in late autumn, nearly 14 months after the board meeting that had remade the company, a new analyst joined the Meridian staff, a young man in his second week, still learning the building's geography, still figuring out which elevator served which floors. He took a wrong turn and arrived in the 35th floor conference corridor, where a man in a plain dark shirt was carefully wiping down the surface of a long table with a folded cloth. The analyst stopped in the doorway. He read the situation the way you read a situation when you are new and are still mapping every variable. He stepped in and offered to help move the chairs. The man in the plain shirt said that would be appreciated, yes. They moved 4 chairs in the easy silence of two people who have a common, minor task and neither ego nor history between them. The young man asked how long he'd worked here. The man said a very long time. The young man asked if it was a good place. The man said it was getting better. And the way he said it, with the quiet conviction of someone who had watched the getting better from the inside, who had in fact been a primary cause of it, and who was not prepared to announce, that carried a specific weight that the young analyst could not quite account for. He thanked the man and continued down the corridor. Harrison set the cloth down and stood at the window for a long moment and looked at Chicago laid out below in its afternoon light, all the way down to the street where, if you followed the sidewalk south for 2 blocks, a woman in a dark coat was walking her familiar morning route, unhurried, without destination, past the coffee shops and the early morning workers and the ordinary human machinery of the city. She stopped at the far corner and turned and looked up at the tower, and from 40 floors above, Harrison watched her look at it the way someone looks at a thing they once possessed and now understand differently, the way you look at something when the understanding arrived too late to change the story, but in time, perhaps, to change the person telling it. Somewhere on the 40th floor, beside the entrance to the main boardroom, there was a glass case mounted to the wall. Inside it, an old mop handle cleaned and refinished, but unmistakably itself, not displayed as irony, not installed as a corporate art gesture with a framed explanation beside it explaining what the viewer was supposed to feel. just mounted, plainly, in its case, the way objects are kept when someone wants the room to hold on to something. Beneath it, a small engraved plate that read only, "Respect is earned by character, not status." The newer employees asked about it when they noticed it. The longer-tenured staff told them the story, in whatever version they had inherited, shaped by their own position in the years during which it had taken place. The maintenance crew had their own version, which was the most accurate and the least theatrical, and which began not with the midnight confrontation in the boardroom, but much earlier, with a man who had spent 23 years learning the names of everyone in the building and remembering them, every single one, without exception, without the need for a performance or an audience or a reason. That version was the one that lasted. That was the version passed along to new members of the overnight crew on their first shift, not as a story about comeuppance or corporate justice, but as a simple and sufficient answer to the question that Margaret Harrison had first posed in a hospital room during the last autumn of her life. Do you know the people you built this for? He had learned, and what he had learned, in the end, could not be reduced to a quarterly report or a restructuring plan or any of the other formal containers in which institutions hold what they have discovered about themselves. It could only be held in the way that the most important things are always held in behavior, repeated, in rooms where no one is watching, with people who have no power to reward you for the effort. Power does not reveal character, it amplifies it, and the way you treat invisible people reveals, with a precision that no performance review or public image can obscure, exactly who you truly are. There is a particular quality to the silence of a building at 3 in the morning that is unlike any other silence. Not empty. A building like Meridian is never entirely empty, not with its mechanical systems cycling, its servers humming, its emergency lighting casting its permanent pale vigil over fire exits and stairwells, but human empty, cleared of the specific density that 1,200 people generate when they are present and moving and wanting things. Walter had come to love that silence over the course of 23 years. He had come to understand it as the building's honest voice, the thing it sounded like when it was not performing for anyone. He had learned the rhythms of the overnight hours the way you learn the rhythms of a long marriage, not by studying them but by living inside them long enough that they simply became the shape of things. He knew which floors settled and creaked when the temperature outside dropped. He knew which elevator doors had a slight hesitation on the 31st floor. He knew the sound of the rain against the north-facing windows of the 42nd floor boardroom, a particular soft percussion that he had listened to hundreds of times while moving his cart along the corridor outside. He knew, with the precise knowledge of someone who has actually been there, what the building looked like from the basement mechanical room at 4 in the morning, with its exposed pipes and its industrial sounds and its total indifference to the expensive architecture above it. That knowledge, the knowledge of the building from the bottom up rather than the top down, was the knowledge he had come back for. It was the knowledge that 23 years of executive life had never given him, and that no amount of reading quarterly reports had been able to supply. Margaret had been right about that. As she had been right about most things, you cannot know a thing from a position of complete separation from it. You have to be inside it. You have to push the cart through the corridor at 3 in the morning and hear the building breathe and understand that the people who do this work every night are not peripheral to the institution but are, in the most fundamental sense, its actual foundation, the ones who ensure that when the executives arrive in the morning, everything is in its place and the surfaces are clean and the lights work and the coffee is ready and the accumulated disorder of the previous day has been returned to order. Without that work, the 42nd floor does not function. The marble lobby does not gleam. The contract signings do not take place in rooms that smell of fresh air and polish. Harrison had watched, over his years on the maintenance crew, the way the building's leadership spoke about operational costs. He had attended invisibly, from the corridor outside open conference room doors, a number of discussions in which the maintenance contract came up as a line item, an area of potential optimization, a place where a small percentage reduction might improve the quarterly margins by a number too small for any executive to actually feel but large enough to register in a presentation. He had heard his own building's workforce described, in the language of people who had never done the work themselves, as a variable cost, not as people, As a variable, this, more than any single incident of personal disrespect, was what had eventually made the decision clear. The culture was not the product of individual cruelty. It was the product of a systematic failure to see an institutional blindness that had been allowed to calcify over years and that no single personnel change would fix. What was required was something more fundamental. What was required was a complete reorientation of the organization's understanding of who mattered, beginning at the level of the person who decided what mattered. Beginning, in other words, with ownership. Harrison had known, for the last 4 years of his time on the maintenance crew, that the timing was approaching. He had been executing the acquisition structure in stages for 3 years, working through holding entities and careful sequencing, patient in the way that a person is patient when they have already waited 20 years, and understand that precision matters more than speed. He had chosen not to execute the final step until he had an answer to the question that had brought him back. Not a partial answer or a qualified answer, but a clear one. Victoria Langston had provided that clarity on the night of the contract celebration, in a room full of witnesses, with a completeness that left nothing ambiguous. She had looked at Walter, at a man who had built the structure she was standing in, who had funded her predecessor's initial hiring budget, whose vision had produced the 40-story tower that was the material basis of her entire career, and she had seen a uniform, only a uniform, nothing beneath it, nothing behind it, no depth or history or humanity. She had not been cruel in an unusual way. She had been cruel in the most ordinary and pervasive way, the way that requires no exceptional malice and leaves no visible mark and is therefore never corrected, never named, never held to account, because no one in the room had the authority to hold her to account, except the old man in the gray uniform. And he was exactly the person she had decided was not worth seeing. He had made the final call to his attorneys from his car, parked in the building's garage, while the party was still running 42 floors above. The documents had been ready for 6 weeks. The only remaining variable had been the timing. The timing was now. The morning after Harrison took the chair after the shock of the boardroom had moved from event to story to the thing the building was talking about in every break room and corridor and elevator conversation, a woman from data analytics team named Priya approached Sandra Okafor with a question she had been holding for 3 years. She wanted to know whether there was a process for reporting a workplace incident that had not been witnessed by anyone with the authority to act on it. Sandra said there would be, beginning that week. Priya described a meeting from the previous year in which she had presented a market analysis that she had spent 6 weeks developing and in which Victoria Langston had interrupted her on the 3rd slide to suggest, in front of the entire room, that the quality of Priya's thinking was more suited to a smaller operation. No one in the room had said anything. Some of them had nodded. Priya had not finished her presentation. She had updated her resume the same afternoon and spent the following 3 months deciding whether to leave. She had stayed, in the end, because she needed the position and because she had told herself that she would try to care less, which turned out to be poor advice that she had given herself and poor advice that she had followed. Harrison, when Sandra summarized the report for him, asked to review Priya's original analysis. He read it in one sitting, on a Thursday afternoon, in the small conference room on the 35th floor. Then he forwarded it to the head of strategy with a note that read, "This is the kind of thinking this company has been undervaluing. Find a role that uses it." The head of strategy found one within the week. Priya received the offer on a Monday morning and sat at her desk for several minutes before she opened it because she had stopped expecting the unexpected to be good. This was not something Harrison tracked or measured. It was simply something that happened when the culture began to move in the direction of seeing people correctly. The mop handle in the glass case was Harrison's idea, and it was one that several of his new executive team had questioned privately, gently, professionally, in the diplomatic language of people who wanted to disagree with their employer without triggering consequences before they understood that he was serious. He had taken the handle from his last assigned cart. He had cleaned and refinished it himself over a weekend in late October at a workbench in the building's basement maintenance room, using the same materials the maintenance staff used. He had asked a building services manager named Carl, who had worked at Meridian for 14 years, to help him choose the right case for it. Carl had helped him without comment. When the case was installed, Carl had stood in the corridor and looked at it for a long time. Then he had said, "He always remembered my birthday." He said it quietly, without context, meaning Harrison, meaning that in 14 years of working in a building run by executives who did not know his name, there had been one person who had reliably known it, had reliably known more than that, had known the name of Carl's daughter, and the fact that Carl's wife had been ill the previous winter, and had asked about her recovery without being prompted. That person had pushed a cart, like the one whose handle now hung on the wall. Carl went back to work. He did not make a speech about it. He did not need to. The plate beneath the case said what needed to be said, and said it briefly enough to be remembered. Respect is earned by character, not status. The newest members of the maintenance crew read it on their first shift, and sometimes asked who had put it there. The answer they received always from someone who knew the story, always delivered with the specific quietness of people who understand that certain things are not performances, was always the same. "The man who used to push this cart," they said. "He owned the building. He just never felt the need to tell anyone.